Well, you've made it to the very last lecture, which is going to be on the urinary system. So let's get started. So as always, we're going to do a little bit of an introduction to the urinary system first, and then we'll work through the anatomy. So the goal of the urinary system is to filter many liters of fluid from the blood, because as we've talked about in circulation and capillary beds, the role of the circulatory system is to distribute nutrients and gases, but at the same time, it's going to be picking up a lot of waste. So we're going to need a way to filter out the blood. And so that is what the urinary system is going to do. It is going to send toxins, metabolic waste, and excess water out of the body. And so what the kidneys are ultimately going to do is produce urine. And they are going to maintain the chemical consistency of the blood. So there's going to be a lot of movement of ions and small chemicals back and forth throughout the kidney. So this is going to help maintain proper sodium levels, calcium level, potassium, chloride, calcium. All of these ions are going to be normalized in the kidneys. And the main waste product is going to be urea, uric acid, and creatinine. All right. And what I'm going to end up showing you probably more towards the end of the talk is that the functional unit of the kidney, the little urine factories, are called nephrons. All right, so what are the organs of the urinary system? So this slide gives a nice view of everything that's involved in the production of urine. So we have the two kidneys, one on each side. We have a urinary tract, which includes the ureters. That's going to transport the urine to the urinary bladder. And then the urine is going to leave our body through the urethra, okay? So urination, or another word for urination, is called micturition. And it is the process of eliminating urine. So by contracting the bladder, we will be able to eliminate this waste. All right, so we're going to start by talking about the kidneys, and then we'll work our way through these other organs. All right, so the kidneys, they are located on each side of the vertebral column in the inferior position. I'm going to show you that on the next slide. The left kidney is slightly superior to the right kidney. And this has to do with the fact that the right lobe of the liver is in that position. So it's going to be a little bit lower, and I'll show you that. And attached to the kidneys are attached to two of the largest blood vessels. All right, we've already worked through these named vessels, but the aorta and the inferior vena cava are attached to the kidneys, because the kidneys are going to receive a tremendous amount of blood so that we can filter all of that waste out of the blood. And the kidneys are kind of in a unique position in the body. They're not actually very well protected. So they're not like protected like as in the thoracic cavity where you have like the rib cage protecting it completely. They kind of are a little bit inferior to the rib cage. So if you get kicked in the back, and I'll show you a picture of it, they are kind of exposed. So there are several layers of protection though that will help maintain the position of the kidneys. And I'm going to go on to show you, and I think what's best is if I just show you a picture of this. So this is a posterior view, and so you're looking at the back. You can see where the kidneys are positioned. So they're right by those floating ribs that we talked about when we were talking about the skeletal system. You can see that the left kidney is a little bit higher than the right kidney. All right. You can see the ureters coming down from the kidneys. Those are going to lead to the bladder. Okay. But you can see how there's not a lot of protection here around the kidneys. So we're going to have other supporting tissue to kind of help protect them. You can see where the urinary bladder sits, and then you can make out the urethra. So let's talk about how the kidneys are stabilized. So as a reminder too, the kidneys are retroperitoneal. So they're actually sitting behind the peritoneal cavity. And they're stabilized by 3 layers. And I have a really nice picture that shows you this. So there's a fibrous capsule that surrounds the kidney. And this is made up of collagen fibers. So this is going to give the kidneys some nice structure and protect them. It's going to cover the entire outer surface of the kidneys. There's also a layer of perinephric fat. All right, and this is a thick layer of adipose tissue that's going to surround that fibrous capsule. And then finally, we have some renal fascia. This is like connective tissue. So there's a dense fibrous outer layer, and this is going to anchor the kidneys to surrounding structures. So let me show you what that looks like. So again, I showed you this picture already to show you where the kidneys are sitting in the body. Now if we take a cross section, so if we take a section right through one of the kidneys there on the left side, you can begin to make out these layers. All right, so here, I think this would still work. So here's the kidney sitting right here. You can see it right there. All right, so on the outer layer of the kidney, you're going to get that fibrous capsule. And then outside of that fibrous capsule, there's going to be some fat. And then outside of that, there is renal fascia. And I actually have a close-up view of this that I found on Teach Me Anatomy that I think is a little bit more helpful. So we're going to stray from your book for just a second. So you can see the kidney here outlined in yellow. You can make out that renal capsule, which is surrounding the entire kidney. Oh, sorry about that. I had a little choking spell. Around that kidney or around that renal capsule, you're going to get that perirenal fat. That's what's shown in green. And then right outside of that is the renal fascia. So all 3 of these are what is helping to maintain the position of the kidneys. There's also some more renal fat, so pararenal, like outside of that area. There's also some more fat that kind of encompasses the kidneys to secure them in their position. But I'm really concerned, or I'm not concerned, but I really want you to know these 3 layers are what is helping stabilize the position of the kidneys, okay? I felt like this just gave you a little bit more detail because it was closer up and color-coded. All right, so let's start talking about the anatomy of the kidney. And I'm going to bring back this word hilum. I introduced hilum to you when we were talking about the lungs. The kidneys also have a hilum. So this is a prominent indentation on the medial side of the kidneys. And again, just like for the lungs, this is the point of entry for the renal artery and the renal veins as well, not the entry. It's the entry for the renal artery. It's the exit region for the renal vein. And you'll also see some renal nerves, and the ureter is leaving that area. Okay, let me show you what the hilum looks like. So I have 2 pictures. So one is a little further away so you can see kind of all of the structures here. So here's that right kidney. Here is the left kidney. You can see how the kidneys are very closely associated with the inferior vena cava as well as the abdominal aorta, because again, a lot of blood is going to flow through these kidneys to filter out all of that waste. I want to point out the hilum here, so you can see it here and you can see it here. Again, this is the point of entry and exit for the renal arteries and veins, as well as the nerves. And you're also going to have the ureter leaving there. And I have a close-up view of this so you can see the image of the hilum a little bit better. And you can also take note of it when you're in the lab. All right, so here's a great representation of the hilum. You can see the renal artery coming in, the renal vein is exiting, and you can also see the ureter is leaving. And that's that indentation right here. That's referred to as the hilum of the kidney. Okay, now we're going to work through the anatomy of some of the internal structures that you see in the kidneys. So, surrounding the kidneys is the renal cortex. This is a superficial region of the kidney that is in contact with the fibrous capsule. And I'm going to show you this all on pictures in a minute. It is reddish brown in color. The kidneys are made up of a series of renal pyramids, anywhere from 6 to 18 triangular structures are located in the kidney. And I think it's best to work off of a picture so I can show you all of the structures that make up the kidney. All right, so let's work from the outside in. So here you can see the fibrous capsule. All right, so let's talk about some general areas first. So this outer area in light pink right here, this whole area right here is called the renal cortex. The cortex is that outer layer. The middle layer is called the renal medulla. That's anything around this area. That would be considered the renal medulla. All right, then you have, and let me erase my medulla and cortex for now. Then within that medulla region, you have a series of renal pyramids, which are those triangular sections that you see. You see many of them all around the kidney. Those are the renal pyramids. All right, so let's also talk about another structure that's commonly talked about when referring to kidneys is something called a kidney lobe. All right, and that's what's kind of highlighted right here in this section with those black dots. You can see those black dots. So what a kidney lobe consists of, it consists of one renal pyramid. It consists of the renal cortex, which is this area around the outside. And then it also consists of a renal column. The columns are on this side, okay? So you have the renal columns, the renal cortex, and the renal pyramid is going to make up a kidney lobe. Oh, and I just noticed that the renal cortex and renal medulla are shown here by these little arrows. That's actually better than what I had drawn. So you can see the medulla here and then the cortex here. All right, so we will go in and talk about the nephron, where it's located, how it's making urine. But right now I'm just doing kind of the gross anatomy. So let's talk about a couple other features. So urine is going to be made, okay, and it's going to flow out these pyramids in this direction. Let me wipe off everything that I've just written on here. So it's going to flow in this direction. And we'll talk about how that's happening. But right now, just imagine that urine is being made. It is then going to come out into these what's called a minor calyx. These are these little funnels here that are near those pyramids. So there is a minor calyx, here's a minor, here's a minor, here's a minor. The minor calyx then merges into what's called a major calyx, which is this region here. So you have minor calyces merging into major calyces, okay? And then what you get is all of those major calyces merge into what's referred to as the renal pelvis, which is this area here. So again, urine's going to be flowing this way. It's going to then dump into the renal pelvis, where it'll make its way down the ureters. That's essentially how urine is going to leave the kidneys. All right, I was just looking over everything, and the only other term that I forgot to go over is the renal papilla. The papilla, let me change colors so that you can see. Let's do green. The renal papilla are these little tips right here. Remember, papilla means nipple-like. Those are the renal papilla. So urine is going to flow through the renal pyramid, out the renal papilla, into the minor calyx, which then dumps into the major calyx, which then dumps into the renal pelvis, and then goes out the ureters. Hopefully you got that. If you want me to draw a flow chart, I certainly can on the board, but that is how urine is going to essentially pass through the kidneys. And actually, that is really spelled out down here for you, so you don't have to frantically be taking notes. All right, let's move on. So, urine production. And now this is where it's going to get a little bit more technical, but we're going to work through it nice and slowly. So, as I was saying, the whole job of the kidneys is to filter our blood. So basically what's happening is that the kidneys are receiving a lot of blood. 20 to 25% of our total cardiac output is reaching the kidneys. That is 1,200 milliliters of blood each minute. Imagine that, if you will. That's how much blood is being filtered to eliminate waste out of the bloodstream. So each of the kidneys are receiving blood through the renal artery. And then we've been through circulation, so you are now familiar with the arteries and the veins of most of the organs. What we're going to spend some time talking about is the nephron. That's the little urine factory. This is microscopic. You can't see it on pictures. You can see parts of it under the microscope, and we will attempt to do that in lab. So again, the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. It is the little machine that is going to make urine. Each consists, so we're going to talk about the entire structure of the nephron if you're not familiar of it. It consists of a renal corpuscle and a renal tubule. And we're going to break all of this down. But right now, the most important part to realize is that the nephron is located in the renal cortex, only in the renal cortex. So if I bring you back to this picture here, and I'm going to highlight this in yellow, the nephron is located only in this outer region right here. That is what is going to be making the urine and sending it through those pyramids. All right, and again, we're going to talk about how the nephron is constructed and all of the features of that. And we'll also talk about the renal corpuscle. Shoot, that's not what I wanted. And if you've ever heard of Bowman's capsule, I don't know how much biology background you guys have, but I'm going to give you an introduction to nephrons and how they work. All right. And this is the slide that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about and trying to understand the structure and the function of the nephron. All right, so we're going to start talking about the nephron and the collecting system. And so I'm going to break it up into parts and kind of work through this diagram. Okay, so here is the nephron in purple, and there's 3 distinct regions that make up the nephron. Something called the renal corpuscle, which is here. And then there's a tubule system. So there's a proximal convoluted tubule and a distal convoluted tubule. And it's named that based on its location to the renal corpuscle. Okay. And then finally, we'll talk about this collecting system. So again, the nephron is what is going to filter the blood and send part of the fluid, whatever gets filtered out through the tubule system, through the collecting system, and out of the body. So let's talk about each of these components. All right, I'm going to take you back a slide because we're going to start here with the renal corpuscle, which is this number 1 here. All right, so this is a spherical structure, and it contains a capsule, which is also called a glomerular capsule, or because of the person who identified it first, his name was Bowman. It's also referred to as Bowman's capsule. And then inside the capsule is a structure called the glomerulus. And this is a capillary network. We've talked a lot about capillary networks. So this is actually where the blood is going to be filtered. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this renal corpuscle. Okay, so again, it contains a capsule on the outside. This is going to form the outer wall of the corpuscle. Now, we have a lot of models, really good models of the kidney in the lab that I really want you to work with to start to begin to understand these anatomical terms. All right, so again, the capsule is this outer wall. Inside the capsule is going to be the glomerular capillaries. That's just what they're called, but it's a capillary bed where the filtration is actually going to occur. And again, this is going to be continuous with the renal tubule. So you can look back here and you can see this renal corpuscle is continuous with all of these tubules, okay? So let's break this down and start talking about it. So the glomerulus, this is again this capillary network, and there's about 50 of these intertwined capillaries, and they are fenestrated capillaries, so they're going to contain little holes in there, little holes in the capillaries, okay? And so blood is going to enter the glomerulus through an afferent arteriole, afferent meaning arriving, and then it's going to get filtered in the capillary. Things are going to exit out of that capillary system, but whatever's remaining, that blood that's now been filtered, is going to then leave the glomerulus through the efferent arterioles. Okay, so we can take a close-up look at this, but before we do, I want to tell you about one other feature. And this is kind of, it's gonna sound familiar because we saw something like this when we talked about the blood-brain barrier. There are specific types of cells called podocytes that reside on top of that capillary bed. These cells sit down on those capillaries, okay? And they have large foot processes called pedicels that wrap around the capillaries, and they're going to create filtration slits. And these are narrow gaps. So this is like a strainer upon, like taking a cheesecloth and then using a strainer. So we're going to do double filtering is basically what you're going to see here. All right, so let's go over these features that I just talked about. So this is a blown up view of that renal corpuscle. All right, so you can see the capsule on the outside, and then on the inside of this capsule is the actual glomerulus, which again is just the term used for the capillary bed. Okay, so you can see the glomerular capillaries here. I'm going to highlight what I want you to know because there's a lot to the kidneys and the nephron that you're going to learn about in physiology. My goal is just to give you a little bit of an introduction so you can kind of understand the process and how the kidneys are working. All right, you can see here, this is the afferent arteriole. Blood, lots of blood. We just talked about how much blood is going to flow through the kidneys because we want to filter all of the blood. So the blood is going to arrive through the afferent arteriole. It's going to flow through this glomerulus or the capillary bed. You can now see those podocytes. That's what's pictured in, let's say, light purple. You can see all those little foot processes here, the pedicels. All right, and they're forming filtration slits. All right, so what's going to happen? The blood is going to flow through there, and all of the things that we don't want in our blood is going to be removed. So those slits are narrow enough so that big things like red blood cells don't escape. Nothing like that is going to escape. But small things are going to get squeezed out of that glomerulus structure right there. And it's going to enter the capsule here. And then it's going to flow through and toward those tubules, that network, the proximal convoluted tubule, and then the distal. We haven't talked about the tubule system yet, but I just want you to see what is happening in the glomerulus. What all the things that don't get filtered out is going to go back into our bloodstream, and it's going to leave the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole. So it's like a strainer system right here. So blood's going to flow through it. Things that we don't want is going to enter the capsule and it's going to leave. And everything else is going to remain in the blood and flow right back out and then continue to flow through our body. So you can just kind of think of it as little filtering systems that are all around. Now remember, the nephron is only located in the cortex of the kidney, okay? So blood will flow in, it'll flow out, and then everything we don't want is going to leave. So the filtrate is going to be squeezed out of the glomerulus, and it's going to eventually be converted into urine. I have one other really cool picture that kind of highlights how this capillary network has those fenestrations. So let's see, the endothelium is fenestrated, so you can see all the little pores here, right, in the lining. You can see the podocyte sitting on top. You can see how these little feet, the pedicels, form these filtration slits. So as blood flows through there, you can see small molecules, we're mostly talking about ions, are going to be filtered out of the glomerulus through this mechanism. So once we make it through the glomerulus, that fluid, the fluid that is going to be ultimately made into urine, is going to hit the renal tubules before it goes to the collecting duct. And the renal tubules, there can still be a lot of exchange of ions that occur in the renal tubules. So it's not destined to leave the body as urine until it makes it to the collecting duct. So during its pathway or travels through the renal tubule, we can still absorb ions back and forth depending on what our body needs. So there's two segments of the renal tubule, as I was mentioning. There's a proximal convoluted tubule, or the PCT, and the distal convoluted tubule, or the DCT. And I'm going to show you images. We're going to take a closer look at the tubule system as well. And then there is a segment that separates those two tubules. There's a loop to it. It's U-shaped. And again, based on the person who discovered it, it was named the loop of Henle. Okay, and I'll show you that. And this loop actually does extend out of the cortex and into the medulla of the kidney. And again, there's going to be some additional ion exchange that can happen in that loop before the solution is determined to leave the body. So again, while traveling along the tubule fluid will gradually change in composition because, again, there's a lot of ion movement back and forth. So substances can be reabsorbed. We can decide, you know what, we need more calcium, or we need more sodium, or chloride, or any of these ions. We need more of that, we're going to keep it. Or no, we have too much of that, we're going to secrete it. So that's what's happening in this renal tubule system. So here we're at 2, and here's 4, and then here's this loop of Henle. That's what this structure is right here. So again, the fluid will flow through the proximal convoluted tube first. So it'll make its way, let me change colors. It'll make its way through this tubule. It'll then be referred to as the descending limb, because we're going to descend now toward the loop of Henle. So this part is the loop of Henle. Then it will go up the ascending limb, and it'll turn into the distal convoluted tubule. So again, what is being highlighted here, which I'm not going to go into too many details, because again, you're going to get this in physiology. There's a lot of water that's being reabsorbed. There's a lot of solute ions being moved back and forth, because this is, again, depending on the needs of our body, we can make changes to this solution. Once the solution hits the collecting system, that's it. It's going to exit the body as urine. All right, so let's take a moment to talk about the collecting system. So this is a series of tubes that is going to carry, and it's called tubular fluid. It's not called urine yet until it makes it kind of to the collecting system. It's going to take the tubular fluid away from the nephrons, and it's going to enter the collecting ducts. So there are collecting ducts that are going to receive fluid from many nephrons. It's going to kind of all pool together. The collecting ducts begin in the cortex. They descend into the medulla, and they are going to carry fluid. So remember, we talked about the little papillary duct at where the pyramid was in the kidney. That is going to then drain into that minor calyx. So if you kind of piece all that back together, it's flowing from the nephron into the collecting duct, into that renal pyramid, and then to the papillary duct, which then drains into the minor calyces. Okay, and then of course it goes into the major. You can kind of remember that from when I was just talking about it a few slides back. So so you can kind of see here's the cortex. So right here is the cortex of the kidney. Here is the medulla. So just to give you an idea of how the nephron is sitting, and I'm going to talk about these two different types of nephrons here in a minute, but you can see that the loop of Henle actually kind of dips down into the medulla a little bit. All right, here is the collecting duct, here's a collecting duct, and here's a collecting duct. And then the collecting duct will then dip all the way down through the medulla, and then here's kind of where that pyramid was, that renal pyramid, if you can imagine that. It's going to dump its contents here by the renal papilla, and then it's going to flow out into the make its way to the calyces. We have two types of nephrons in the body, in the kidneys, okay? The two types are called cortical nephrons and juxtamedullary nephrons. Most of the nephrons that are in the kidneys are cortical nephrons. They make up about 85% of all the nephrons. Again, I feel like I've said this a bunch of times. They are located, in the cortex. The juxtamedullary nephrons, they are more rare. And as I showed you on the previous slide, they do dip down kind of deep into the medullary region. So here's that cortical nephron. So again, it dips down a little bit into the medulla, but not a whole lot. Here's that juxtamedullary nephron. It does dip down into the medulla quite far. The difference between the nephrons, and I think I'll just sum this up as briefly as I can, is that we use these juxtamedullary nephrons quite rarely. It's really when we are in a more dehydrated situation and water is not abundant. And this, I would never ask you this on an exam. I'm just telling you this. You're going to probably learn about it in physio. When water is scarce and we need to make more concentrated urine, you will use the juxtamedullary nephrons over the cortical nephrons, okay? That's the difference. All I want you to know is that the majority of the nephrons are cortical nephrons. All right, so let's move on. We're going to look at the histology of the kidney, and you're going to be able to make out these beautiful Bowman's capsules with the glomerulus here on the inside. So you can see, I don't know if this is the best color, but you can see the capsule here on the outside. You can see this glomerular capillary network in the middle. So hopefully you'll be able to make this out. These round structures, right, let me change colors because this is silly. These round structures right here, you'll see a lot of these. These are cross sections of those proximal and distal tubules. So that's what you're seeing on the outside. You see a lot of the tubules, but you can sometimes, if you're lucky, make out the glomerulus. Here's another histology image showing you the renal corpuscle, which is outlined here. You can make out the glomerular capillaries in the middle. It is very hard to determine which is the afferent and which is the efferent arteriole, but you can see that they're present. You wouldn't be able to determine which one is which. All right, so we have to talk about one more concept, and I know this looks crazy, so just bear with me. We've been talking about the glomerulus, and we've been talking about how blood, or I've been telling you how blood enters the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole, and then it exits through the efferent arteriole. But the question is, which I haven't gone over, is how does blood actually make it to the nephron, right? So we know that blood is going to enter through the renal artery. It has to make it to the glomerulus, and it's going to go through a series of arteries to get to the cortex. And unfortunately, you have to know this. So let me go through this pathway with you. The good news is it goes in, it goes out the same way it goes in. So if you can memorize the arteries, the named arteries, to get to the glomerulus, you can then exit the glomerulus. Okay, so let's do this. All right, so first, blood, lots of blood, is going to flow through the renal artery. Okay, so you can kind of see it flowing here. The renal artery is going to branch in what is called a segmental artery. Okay, so you can kind of see that branching happen there. I think that I'm going to choose green or it's going to get confusing. From the segmental artery, it's going to branch again into what's called an interlobar artery. And it's called the interlobar artery because it kind of like passes along those lobes of like where the pyramid lobes are. Okay, so it's kind of coming along the side here. From the interlobar artery, it's going to branch into what's called the arcuate artery. And you can think of arc like it's forming an arc. It's kind of going up and around the pyramid. So when it makes this up and around turn, it becomes the arcuate artery. From there, I'm not laughing at you guys. I'm just, the material is a little bit much, but that's okay. We got this. So there's another artery, and I actually don't, the name of this other artery can be confusing, and it has two names in the literature. I like the second name because it tells you exactly where it is. So the arcuate artery branches into the cortical radial artery. And so it's these little guys that kind of branch. So it's in the cortex, right? This is the cortex. This area right here is the cortex of the kidney. So it's the cortical radial because it's like radiating out artery. So I like to use cortical radial artery. From that artery, it then arrives at the glomerulus and goes into the afferent arteriole. Okay, there's some parts of this diagram that we're going to ignore. It then enters the glomerulus, and that's where it's going to get filtered. All right, after it gets filtered, it's going to exit the glomerulus by the efferent arteriole. We're going to skip these. And then we're going to go back out the same way we came. Now it's going to go into the venous system, okay, because it's been filtered and it's going to go back toward the heart. So instead of this named vein, we're going to go with the cortical radial vein. That's going to branch into the arcuate vein. The arcuate vein will then turn into the interlobar vein, and then it'll exit the kidney through the renal vein. That is how blood flows through the kidney and the glomerulus. So that's how it enters, that's how it gets to the glomerulus, and that's how it gets back. It's actually kind of important, so it is good to understand how blood is flowing through the kidneys. I also want to mention that, and you probably realize this, that there was no segmental vein. This is a little bit like it's argued in the literature a little bit, but we're going to use this diagram as our flow, and we're going to go with the idea that there is no segmental vein. It goes from the interlobar vein, and then it enters the renal vein. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out because you probably noticed that when I was going through the slide. All right, so now that we have made urine, we are going to talk about the ureters and the bladder. Those will be the last concepts of this lecture. So the ureters are a pair of muscular tubes, if you remember from the very first slide, that the ureters travel from the kidneys all the way down to the bladder. They sit retroperitoneal. They are going to penetrate the posterior wall of the urinary bladder. You will be able to take a look at where the ureters penetrate the bladder by this really great model that we have in the lab. There are these, this is a hard word to say, ureteric orifices, which are little slits, which is where the ureters are going to penetrate, okay? And these little slits will help to prevent the backflow of urine when the urinary bladder contracts. All right, and we will probably look at histology. And if you remember from Unit 1, that the type of epithelium that you will find in both the ureters and in the bladder is that transitional epithelium. So we'll probably take another look at the transitional epithelium now that you have some context and have learned about the urinary system. It will make more sense. And again, this transitional epithelium is there so that the ureters as well as the bladder, it allows the tissue to be able to be stretched and then kind of goes back to its normal shape as it's emptied. All right, so let's just discuss the anatomy of the bladder. So it is a hollow muscular organ. I have boxed the terms that I want you to know. It serves as a temporary storage for urine, and a full bladder can contain almost a liter of urine. So let's point out some of these features. So you can see the ureters here, and again, they are going to enter the bladder on the posterior side, okay? The muscle that makes up the bladder is called the detrusor muscle. All right, that's what's pictured here in pink. We do not have control over this. This is an involuntary smooth muscle. That's the detrusor muscle. You will recognize the term rugae, right? We saw that in the stomach. They're little folds, and this allows the structure to expand. So there are rugae in the urinary bladder. You can see I don't know why I have such a hard time saying this word, ureteral openings. That is where the ureter is going. Those are those tiny little slits I was mentioning on the previous slide so that we don't get backflow of urine. At the inferior part of the bladder, let me change colors here. There is this funnel-like shape right here. This is called the trigone, and it acts as a funnel so that the urine will travel inferiorly. And then there's going to be 2 sphincters that will control the release of the urine. There is an internal urethral sphincter and an external urethral sphincter, okay? And then you can see, and then, so this is bladder depicted here would be male because you can see the prostate gland sitting around where the urethra is going to be. So here is part of the urethra. In the males, and I'm going to go over this in the next slide, the urethra is surrounded by both the prostate gland, and then there's what's called a membranous urethra. I'm going to break this down here in the next slide. All right, so the urethra. This is what is going to transport urine from the neck of the urinary bladder to the exterior of the body. And it is coated in, there are mucus cells located in the urethra. So let us first look at the male urethra, and then we'll switch to the female, and then we'll end this lecture. So the male urethra extends from the neck of the urinary bladder. All right, so here is the urinary bladder pictured here. Whoops, my outline is not the best. All right, and it's going to go from the neck of the urinary bladder to the tip of the penis. And there are 3 regions of the male urethra. There is what's called the prostatic urethra. Okay, so that's this little area right here. Let me switch again, colors. Let's go with green. Right here. There is a membranous urethra. That is this short segment that's going to pass through this little muscle right here, the perineal muscle. And then there's the spongy urethra. All right, and that's this region right here that's going to go all the way through the penis. So there's 3 separate areas that make up the male urethra. The female bladder and urethra is much different. The urethra is much shorter in females than in males. So you can see the urinary bladder here is outlined in green for the female, and then you can see the urethra right here. All right, so that's the extent to which we're going to cover the urinary system. We have completed, you have now completed the very last lecture of anatomy. You should be very proud of yourselves, and you should pat yourselves on the back. Congratulations on finishing the course. All you have now is the exam. So study hard, and I will see you in lab.